Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me fine? My sound's good? Great. All right. Yes, a very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you so much, Thorsten, for that introduction. It really is a pleasure to be with you all this morning and to have so many people on the call. I'm really looking forward to engaging with you. So yeah, my name is Jennie. This is a topic that's very close to my heart. And throughout the talk today, I will be sharing both a combination of kind of thoughts and prompts around this topic, but also some quite personal stories as well of how I and others that I've journeyed with have really grappled with this topic of dismantling race and racism in our homes, in our communities, in our organizations. So I just want to start by sharing, last night, one of my 8-year-old sons prayed, "Dear God, please stop racism. Make sure it never comes back. Even after I pass away someday, please let it never come back." And I was so touched by my son's long view forward. He's only 8 years old, and here he's talking about a change that he wants to see that will outlast him, long after he's gone, which quite surprised me that he was thinking that far ahead. And I think maybe it's a big assumption on my part, but I think most likely that's a common desire of many of us who are gathered on this call this morning. So I'm grateful for this space. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you to Thorsten and the others involved in TGIFX for creating this space. And Mpo is on the call with us as well. Thorsten mentioned that's my husband, and I see a few other faces that I know or names that I know, and just very grateful to be here. So just to tell you a little bit more about myself, John, you were asking right as we started the call, a little bit more about myself before I get into the topic at hand, although the two are very closely related. So I was born in the United States, but I actually grew up in Malaysia and the Philippines to missionary parents. They were part of an organization called Wycliffe Bible Translators, which you might recognize the name. That's the same organization that Mpo shared. So quite an interesting story. Today, Mpo and I are now working for Wycliffe, which is the same organization that I grew up as a missionary kid in many, many years ago. So about 14 years ago, I moved to South Africa to study at the University of Cape Town. And that's where Mpo and I met each other. So we live in the south of Johannesburg. We have 3 sons. And so we both involved in this work of Bible translation, of which I do see Karen, who's our director. She's on the call with us today as well, which is wonderful. And then, we started the Kopanya Institute with 2 friends of ours from our UCT days who have always shared just a passion and a concern around issues of identity, race, and transformation. So as Kopanya, these days we're mostly offering online courses. We do courses with teachers at schools, with individuals, and with other types of organizations. So the last bit I'll tell of my personal journey, and then I'll get into the content and share some more stories as we go along. Doing the work around race and racism has been quite a journey for me. Because I was raised in a household with very loving, God-fearing parents, but where there were no conversations about race that I can recall growing up. And that felt and is a big silence, considering the context that I was born in, the history in the United States. And unfortunately, I only came to an awareness of racism in my late teens. And actually at the time, felt a huge sense of betrayal and guilt for my ignorance, for complicity in this system. And at the same time, a sense of responsibility. And I'm really grateful for people who walked with me at that time and journeyed with me to kind of shift that sense of guilt into a sense of, okay, so what is my responsibility? What do I need to do? And who do I need to be? So I've had to really work through the question of, who am I to talk about this topic? With this skin I'm in, with this accent that I have, with the background that I have. But thankfully, through walking the journey with others, as I've said, I think that question has shifted in my mind to who am I not to be talking about this topic? And if there was a deafening silence around it in my church, in my community, growing up, then I need to be part of breaking the silence and having these conversations and being the change that, my son was praying for. So that's how I come to this work and care a lot about it, and know at the same time that it can be very hard. I've been in many very contentious conversations, even in my own extended family and in different spaces that Mpo and I have found ourselves in. So yeah, I want to start by just saying that often in workshops and courses that I've been in, either as a participant or facilitating, people have often said, the issue, the picture, it looks so big. Where do I start? I can't fix the whole world, they'll say. What do I do? I feel overwhelmed. And so I think how I come to the talk today is to encourage us that there are so many places to start. And in fact, some of you may have read the book White Fragility, but the author and speaker Robin DiAngelo, she says if you're sitting with that question or that feeling of being held back, not knowing where to start, she actually says that one of the starting places is to sit down and write all the reasons why we don't know where to start. And how has a socialization or the context we find ourselves be prohibiting us from seeing the many things that we can be doing at this time and in where we're at in history. So my hope is that today, in this very short session, that it will either encourage you to continue on the path you're on, not to give up, not to give in, and to know you're not alone in tackling this topic, or to empower you to engage more, to look into the locked cupboards, the dark corners in our organizations and in our communities and ourselves, where there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And it's, I found it's particularly important, and why, in the heading of this talk, I specifically said spiritually and socially conscious communities. I think, and this is why I said it's close to my heart, it's really important to be having these conversations in these types of communities. Because there can be big blind spots in terms of, wanting to do good in the world and doing a lot of good in the world, and yet not seeing how unintentionally harm might be being done as well, and having the courage to look at that. So, for myself, having grown up in the mission field, worked in several Christian organizations, served in many different churches, I've seen both the good and the blind spots up close in myself and in the organizations. And so that's kind of the starting point for the conversation today. And I'll just say as a disclaimer, the content that I'll be sharing with you is normally spread out over about 8 weeks. That's normally the length of the courses we run. So this is a super condensed version. And if it does seem like I'm going quite fast, please feel free to ask questions at the end, or, I'll put my WhatsApp number at the end if you want to engage in further conversation. I'd be very happy to do so. And so I've structured this talk around 10 questions to ask yourself or your organization, your church, your community, that can help illuminate some of the areas that might be more difficult to look at, but where we need to pay attention, where transformation might be needed. And as I pose these questions and share some personal examples, you're very welcome to use the chat box, because it's framed as questions. If you want to respond, if you have a thought, if you have an experience that you've had, you're welcome to post it there, or you can save it to the end of the presentation as well. Either way, and we'll have some time for questions and engagement. So I'm going to just share my screen and start the presentation. So I want to start just by putting up very quickly a diagram. Technology is going to cooperate. There we go. And I found this diagram, I saw it recently and found it really helpful because it touches on the many different dimensions of racism and that come up in a lot of the work that we do around this topic. And that it's not, we can't look at this just from one angle. So this might be new for some of you, might not be new at all for others of you, but it's helpful just in terms of positioning the questions that I'm going to ask in this talk, that when we talk about racism, we're looking at it from an institutional level. At times, that's the policies and practices, you can see there how it's defined, that reinforce racism within a workspace or an organization. Then you'll often hear about systemic or structural racism. You can see there, if you shift over to the right, that's when multiple institutions collectively hold racist policies and practices, a society. And I think that's where you see a lot of the protests that are happening in the United States, for example, is protesting racism at that level. Then if you shift down to look there at the bottom, racism also manifests and shows up at an interpersonal level. And that's some of what I'll be talking about today as well, where racist acts or microaggressions happen between individuals. And then there's also internalized racism, and that's the subtle, you can see there, or overt messages that we internalize and that can play out in terms of how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us. So I think just keep that diagram kind of in the back of your minds as I move through the presentation, because it's a helpful framework to remember that it's not just what happens in between two people, it's also not just what happens in one organization, but it happens on all these levels. So the first question that I'd encourage us to think about and reflect on is, and I know it's been very, very informative and continues to be in my own story, in my own life, is what can I learn from my own story and socialization that will lead me to a place of greater humility and courage in engaging with the topic of race and racism. So as I said earlier, I grew up in a family, loving, God-fearing parents, and I'm so grateful to them for teaching me a lot about my heritage and my ancestry growing up. And there was great awareness of cultural differences, but as I said, very little mention of race. And unfortunately, as I've had to explore my own story, and I'll just give you a little glimpse. So when I said we grew up on the mission field, there's a picture of my sister and I sitting on the front steps of our house when we were living in Malaysia. And I think the unfortunate thing, and this is where, we need to be willing to look critically, as I said, into the less looked at spaces, is I absorbed quite a bit of cultural superiority growing up. Even with the best of intentions, this can happen, and it's still happening in our world today. And I absorbed early messages about race, even without my parents speaking explicitly about it. So one example that I can give that's very prevalent, I know in the American context, but a lot of South Africans that I've spoken to really resonate with it here as well, is I was often taught that, well, if you just try hard enough, you can make it. That American dream, anyone can try hard enough if they make it. And it sounds good on the surface. It sounds very inspirational. It sounds like, you're encouraging your kids to just try their best so that they can make it in life. But I think the downside, and this is some of the unpacking I had to do with my own socialization, is how I unconsciously absorbed this notion that anyone, through their own effort, can make it. So then what do I see in the world if I come up against people who are not making it, people who are trapped in poverty or in really difficult circumstances? And again, I was growing up in the American context first, and this is really prevalent. So people look and they say, oh, well, that person just hasn't tried hard enough. They've just not been able to make it for it's their own weakness or something in themselves. And it's not. Most of the time it's structural, and there is that combination of individual effort, and people do make it out of very difficult circumstances. But I was so blind because of that socialization to the way in which systemic and structural racism has put in place very specific boundaries and blockages to people's progress. So in asking this question, I'm encouraging us in our communities, in our spaces, to really challenge some deeply internalized paternalism that it can exist, the superiority and inferiority complex that is the core of racism. And as one grows in awareness, this can be really hard. So it can be, as I said, it was a hard journey for me coming into this awareness. And I think the liberating part, and you heard in Thorsten's introduction that our hope in Kopanya is liberating hope in divided societies. For me, the liberation has come in realizing that I'm not to blame for the past or the way I was socialized, but I'm accountable for what I have inherited and what I do with it. And that's a big shift. And that's, I think, where the humility needs to come from, is that recognition. And so, yes, a question that I'd encourage you, I encourage myself on a regular basis to sit with. So I'm going to keep going to the next question. And as I said, if anyone has thoughts, Thorsten said he'll keep an eye on the chat box for me and let me know if there's anything that you want to share. So the second question, and it's closely linked to the first, it's now expanding maybe past my personal story, is, am I willing and equipped to face the past in my society, in my family, my ancestry, or in my organization? And this can be a really painful process. And often the tendency, and I'm sure you've heard the narrative that circulates of, can't we just move on? Why are we stuck in the past? And I just want to encourage all of us to say, we need to face the past. There's so much trauma there that we are far, far, far from being ready to just quickly move on. And that doesn't mean that there's not a desire for it. That's why I started with that story of my son's prayer. We can desire and long for a different future, but that doesn't mean that we need to move quickly past what was there and where this came from. So an example from my own story and having to explore my own ancestry and sometimes the complexity of it, and I know in the South African context this is true as well, is that, you know, I grew up being, a lot was shared with me about where we came from. And some of my ancestors were some of the, what were called the pilgrims at the time. They came from England over to the Americas. And the way the story was taught to me, and it has a big element of truth in it, was that they were running away from religious persecution. So they were looking for a place of freedom. And so that was a powerful, and I see a question there coming through the chat. Do I see a significant difference between racism and xenophobia? And I think I'll hold on to that question and come back to it right at the end, if that's okay. So as we look into the past, as I said, I had to come to grips with the fact that I have ancestry that came to the Americas in the early days looking for their own place of freedom. And yet the part that I wasn't aware, didn't fully grapple with, was what happened subsequently with the interaction between the early settlers in America and the first peoples there, the Native Americans, who initially welcomed the pilgrims and helped them settle and helped them survive very harsh conditions, and yet were subsequently dispossessed from their land. So that has been painful for me to look at, but really, really important. And I think there's a place, a space that all of us need to enter into to look at the ways in which race and racism have manifest in our own families. And I'll say a little bit more in terms of even in our organizations as well. Well, maybe just to mention it now, actually, is the way in which mission work has been complicit with colonialism. And, you know, and there's very conflicting stories about how often missionaries were running counterculture and were doing things in society that was not what was dictated by the colonial regime, and yet at other times were completely complicit with it. And, you know, we've had these conversations even within Wycliffe of, you know, can we look at this past? Can we look at it and really talk about it and not shy away from it, so that we don't ever recreate these patterns again? I see another question coming in the chat. And facing the past, how do you reconcile loving your family and hating what they did and seeing pressure to self-hate? That is such a good question. And I think that's why, you know, this is a process over time. And it's a process that I know for myself I've had to do in community with other people, because it can be very painful. And I have to say, there's still conversations in my own family that have just only started, and I get impatient and I want us to have the conversation, and I have realized that these layers have to be peeled back one piece at a time. And I think where I've been able to separate hating what they did from loving my family is this thing of recognizing that we are socialized, that we are a product of what happened historically. And that's why I said earlier, not to blame my family or myself for what happened, but to take accountability, to say, okay, so given that that's what happened, what needs to happen now going forward? And so then to operate from a place of empowerment and wanting to change rather than from a place of guilt. But that's a huge question, and I think it's one we can maybe talk about more of at the end if I haven't sufficiently addressed it. But I find, and I was talking to someone just this week, that sometimes having the conversations in our own families is one of the most difficult places to start. Yeah, it's hard to confront the past. It's hard to look at the links. And there was a book actually before I came to South Africa that I read that I'd really encourage you. And it's a hard book to read, but it really opened my eyes to the way we have to confront our past in our families. It's a book called My Traitor's Heart, by a South African who was grappling with the complicity of his ancestor and his ancestry and his family's role in apartheid. So I'm going to move on. The third question then, at a personal and organizational level, have we sufficiently interrogated the concept of race and how we use racial terms and categories? And this one is really big, and I could spend the whole session actually talking just about this. But what it's trying to get at is to say, we can talk a lot about racism and how racism manifests, but have we gotten to the roots of how race was actually constructed by humans at a particular time in history? So you'll see there in this picture, there's a whole spectrum, of human variation. This is skin color, the whole variation from light to dark. And yet at a particular moment in history, and then subsequently following that, the categories were created. And the categories themselves are the problem. And yet we use them as if they're normal, as if they're inherent in our biology and DNA. And I'll give an example of where I've come up across that, even in our churches and Christian communities. But there was very specific moments in history where these categorizations were put in place. You know what that looks like from the apartheid picture, but long before. You can see that little image there in the corner. Carl Linnaeus and many others created systems of scientific classifications. And that's what led to this belief system that there are such things as distinct human races. And yet since the 1930s, this is the crazy thing, population genetics has disproved any form of race science. Human beings belong to one species. There's no scientific foundation. So people know that race is a social construct, that there's nothing in our DNA, in our biology, that proves that there's these distinct categories. And yet they continue to be used, and they can do a lot of violence to people when people are labeled. My own sons have come home asking me and Paul, are they colored? And for people, that's painful for people to apply an apartheid era category. And that's not the same as people identifying with colored of their own choosing as a cultural identity. But the racial terms and categories really need to be re-examined, and we need to find new language and understand that sometimes when the term Black is used as a political designation, so in the sense of Black consciousness or Black Lives Matter, or for redress purposes, that's very different than continuing to apply these categories to each other. And it just is really painful to hear people still calling each other by these categories, Blacks and whites, as if it's a noun, as if it's an object that is definable, that is scientifically provable. So if you're interested in this, there's lots that can be read around this. This, for me, was very critical in my journey of realizing that the concept of race was created for economic reasons, for control, for political reasons, hundreds of years ago, and it still persists to this day. And it still plays out in how people are grouped and categorized. And so, you know, I'll share one painful story I had in a church context. And this is why we have to look at these things in the context of our churches, where I was, Paul was away on a trip at the time, and I was visiting a new church. And I was, you know, warmly welcomed coming in. And then after the service, as I was chatting to different people, a woman came up to me, and it was particularly painful because one of my sons was standing right next to me. And she said to me, "Well, the dark genes certainly are strong, aren't they? But at least they have beautiful curly hair." And I just thought, my goodness, I was quite taken aback, and it was very painful at the way in which she was looking at our sons, through the lens of race, and applying this, kind of dissecting them on the spot in terms of which category, what physical features do they have? Because remember, race is not just skin tone, it's hair, it's shape of the nose, the eyes, and many other features that people use to try to put each other in these boxes and prove that it's somehow linked to our genes and our DNA. So in the moment, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to verbalize how hurtful that was. And so that's something I'll touch on a bit later, questions around how do we find voice and how do we challenge these things in the moment. But what I want to encourage here is it come to the roots of how do we articulate this difference between skin color and the natural variation. And there can be, you know, my boys have a huge curiosity around that. Why do people look different? But how damaging that becomes when we're seeing each other in those categories. I think there was another question that came in. I'm trying to just access the chat box again, but it's disappeared. Okay, I'm going to continue. And Thorsten, if you can just be tracking with it, if there's something that I can come back to there. So the fourth question, and this, again, I hope you're seeing how each question kind of builds on the other and is a way of us continuing to pull back the layers and say, what kind of questions do we need to be having with ourselves and with our organizations? And this is, in what ways have I or my organization objectified, romanticized, or commodified people of color? And again, this is where, you know, I've had to really examine, you know, even in mission communities or in NGOs that do a lot of social good, how are the spaces in which they work romanticized or objectified? You know, hearing people talk about Africa as one thing and romanticizing this notion of Africa. Again, you know, I've struggled with, Mpo and I together have struggled with the way in which there's almost an exoticizing of, you know, mixed families or kids. So another, person coming from the mission field, not here in South Africa, but further north, met me for this first time. You know, I told her a little bit about our family and that I'm married to Mpo. And the first question was, "Oh my goodness, your boys must be really beautiful. What color is their skin?" So just this need to put, that's why the image here, a target on the back of people who don't either fit the box or are the subject of this gaze. We really, really need to interrogate that. And again, another example from church where I saw it, there was a visiting group of young people, part of a team of young people working across different churches. And this was in a church that Mpo and I were in some years ago. And the pastor was introducing the young people, and one particular young man from the DRC, he just pulled him out, put a spotlight on him, used a fake French accent to introduce him. And this is in front of the whole congregation, saying how romantic his accent is. And then this poor young man had to laugh along as he's in this spotlight in front of everyone. I could feel the discomfort. And these kind of things we need to look at. It's not okay. And so I'd really, really encourage you, this is an ongoing work. How does this happen? How do stereotypes or patronizing jokes persist in these spaces? You know, even in our organizations, what images do we use for marketing, and how does that portray people? I'm going to keep moving on. And this is, again, another layer. In what ways are race and racism embedded in our cultural and organizational icons and imagery? So just as much as we need to look at how, you know, race and racism and people of different perceived groups are objectified, we need to look at how does that play out in our cultural, religious, organizational imagery. I was sitting in the car with my boys a few years ago now, and was playing, you know, Christian kids songs to them. And this song came on that I was like immediately, you know, from my childhood, and I started humming along. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it. And it says, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. And I just stopped. I just stopped in my tracks and thought, oh my goodness. This is a song that I consumed as a child. And going back to one of the previous questions, have we fully interrogated this recategorizing, the racialization of these categories? Here, little kids are being taught to see people black and yellow, red and white, and how damaging that is. So right then in the car, also I had a choice. Did I have the conversation with my boys about it then and there, or did I just kind of skip over it? And we had a conversation, and it was an interesting one because kids ask tough questions. So we need to interrogate those things. And similarly, you know, if you close your eyes, what's the first image that comes to your mind of Jesus? It's blue eyes and blonde hair. At least that's the imagery that I grew up with. And representation matters, how we see, and is it actually accurate? How does it reinforce notions around white superiority? My chat box has opened now, and I can see someone asking me, saying for the last example with a fake French accent, I feel a lot of racism isn't intentional. Absolutely. And I think that the challenge here, and it's something that I'll come to in one of the other questions that I ask, is how do we handle things when there is a difference between intention, so intent, and impact? Because often that's used, I think, to excuse many leaders. They didn't have an intention. You know, that pastor I'm talking about, he certainly didn't have an intention to hurt that young man or put him on the spot. But that often stops us from having the conversation. We, in a way, kind of let ourselves or let other people off the hook if it wasn't an intention, and yet the harm is still being done. So I think that's a question I'll come to, is that how do we still raise this and talk about this, even if the intention wasn't to harm? And yes, another question, how would one differentiate between race, socially constructed, and ethnicity? How do we acknowledge differences and celebrate similarities without ungodly pride and prejudice? Very good questions. That's another one I think that if we can just make a note, in addition to the earlier xenophobia question that I'd love to come back to later on at the end. I'm just making a note of that. So yeah, so we need to continue to interrogate how race and racism are embedded in our cultural and organizational icons and imagery, also in terms of who's standing at the front. What does that look like? Who is leading worship, or who is preaching, or who is teaching? And how does that affect what the younger generation sees in terms of who holds those roles? Because I know certainly growing up and in the missions community, everyone who was a so-called missionary in that space looked a particular way. And I think Mpo shared some of this in his talk on the Bible translation movement, but a big shift has been to say, how do we make sure that this is a partnership? there's many people in their communities who want to translate the Bible for their own language groups. And how do we make sure that because of this imagery of the past, it doesn't dictate who can be seen as someone in missions, who does this work and who doesn't do this work? So imagery, language we use is critically important. I'm going to move on to the next question. I'm very conscious of the time. And this is a tough one. And this, I'm very aware might press some buttons, so please feel free. But it's so important, and especially in terms of what is playing out in our world right now, is am I or are we in our organization willing to look at the ways that this is about power and control in leadership? So I've seen many NGOs, religious organizations, churches that say, yes, we are pro-diversity. We want to be diverse, and we are diverse. And yet, unfortunately, when it comes to leadership, something is not happening there. And there's a real sense in which we can't let go of our way of doing things. And so I want to say that in terms of my previous point, representativity is not enough. Authority and power need to be shared at all levels. And, you know, there was another church that Mpo and I were part of, even further back. And it was very telling. The church itself was diverse, but the leadership, the eldership team, which was quite a big eldership team, was predominantly white. And even the guests who were brought in, so the guest pastors who were brought in to speak, were also predominantly white. And there was a big difference even in terms of how they were introduced. So if there was a guest pastor from one of our neighboring African countries, for example, the senior elder in the church would go out of his way telling all of the credentials, all of the academic credentials, as if needing to prove that this person had a right to be in the pulpit and that we should trust what they were going to say. And that was strikingly different from how often that church would have visiting speakers from Europe. And often the introduction there was, "This is an old buddy of mine." And so those are the kind of things that we need to look at. Is the leadership held? And it's hard to look at. I was at a missions conference, also in Europe. And I'm sorry to say these, you know, sometimes even verbalizing these things, it's painful to share them. And yet this is why I said even in that blurb that was sent around, we need to hold up the mirror to these organizations that we're part of, because this is happening and we can't ignore it. So someone in HR in another Christian organization was speaking out quite strongly, saying there's no need for employment equity. There's no need to look at racial diversity in their head office there in the UK. And he went so far as to say, let African leaders lead in Africa. I was so dumbfounded when he said that, because if you look at the flip side, Western and European preachers have for years felt, that the ministry calls them to preach, to teach anywhere in the world. And so this control over who teaches where, who preaches where, we really need to look at that. And unfortunately, and I know, again, there might be very different opinions on this, even in this room, but why are so many so-called Christians supporting Trump and supporting such deeply problematic politics in the US right now? It's about control and power and an unwillingness to let go of that. I've seen, how hard it is, even in church spaces here in South Africa, to talk about employment equity and to talk about transformation. And another very painful story that Mpo and I were part of a conversation in another church here in South Africa many years ago. This church was saying that they actually halted their transformation efforts because they were in the middle of a building fundraiser and they didn't want to risk upsetting people, specifically upsetting wealthy white churchgoers who were giving to the building fund. and wouldn't be happy with the transformation efforts. And I want to just say up front that this, thankfully, and by God's grace, many churches are working in transformation very proactively. But so much more work needs to be done, and these conversations need to be had. And this links to my next question. What will it take to make social justice part of my organization's core work and values? And this is where it's been encouraging to see many Christians in the US and in other spaces speaking out and saying, but yeah, where the church has fallen short, where it's not playing the role it should, this is not a reflection of what our actual core Christian values are, because throughout the Bible, there is talk of social justice. So when a pastor stands up and says there's no race issues here in this church, how do we respond to that? How do we link it back to the biblical values that say, yeah, we can have a focus on evangelism, but that doesn't exclude social justice as well. And that's where it's been really exciting in a place like the Bible translation movement to see how, this is a justice issue as well. There's reconciliation needed and restoration needed in these translation projects where we're working. And unfortunately, it's often seen as a side program. In fact, one church where Mpo and I were also participating, and we were trying to raise these things and saying, how do we look at the way in which even the main church service is run? And we were told, oh, you know what, you can go join the social outreach group. It's not part of the main service. So, the biblical passage that's really been sitting with me, and it's been a topic of conversation in Wycliffe at the moment, is how do we weep with those who weep? How do we bring social justice concerns into the heart of the work that we're doing? Whether you're working in an NGO, whether you're working in a corporate, whether you're working in a church space, how do we make room for that and make it central to our conversations? And unfortunately, often when these conversations, and we've seen this play out, when these conversations try to take place, there's often a lot of policing that starts taking place. And what I mean by this is that people try to then tell others what they should or shouldn't feel. So many conversations about race and racism in these conscious communities where we're in the mission together. And yet people are often told, now you just need to calm down, or you're getting too angry about this, or on the other side, or you're not angry enough. Or if feedback is given, and this is one that Robin DiAngelo again talks about in her book. So say, for example, a person of color comes and gives me feedback on how I'm showing up or something I've said that might be offensive. Now, it's really dangerous if I try to manipulate my own emotions or the other person by going in, finding another friend of mine who's also a person of color and saying, am I really like this? Trying to get affirmation to prove to myself that I wasn't wrong or that I'm actually an okay person. So that kind of manipulation of emotions around the topic, or policing what emotions are allowed or are not allowed, is really damaging and really hinders the conversation. So I read this quote recently that I want to just share with you on this one. And then I just have two more questions, and then we can open it up and look in more detail at some of what you're raising in the chat. This was really profound. It says, when you debate a person about something that affects them more than it affects you, remember, for you, it may feel like an academic exercise. For them, it feels like revealing their pain, only to have you dismiss their experience and something of their humanity. The fact that you might remain calm under these circumstances is a consequence of your privilege, not increased objectivity on your part. So stay humble. So I've heard that often, can't we just be objective in this conversation? Why are we getting so emotional? And my encouragement here is, in our organizations, in the spaces where you move, really try to make space to hear out the emotions without this policing happening. And the policing can also look at this defining of what is racism or not. I've had many, many instances in organizations where a white person wants to tell a person of color what is or isn't racism. And that just closes down the conversation and makes it very unsafe to raise these conversations. And that's not to say that it's not an important conversation to have. Yes, there's a time and a place for unpacking and understanding, does something constitute racism? Or like in the question earlier, or is it a case of xenophobia? But in the moment, when someone's bringing their emotion, that is not the time to police them and tell them what they should or shouldn't be feeling. So moving onwards, and I think this is also closely linked to that, am I ready, willing, and equipped to give and receive feedback? Personally, I've often failed in this area, and that's why this is an ongoing work for me as well. Many missed opportunities where I was either too fearful to give feedback, or I justified it in my mind, or even as the earlier question was pointing to, where I said, oh, the person really didn't mean it, or that's not the church's intention, so maybe I should just leave it. And yet these things need to be spoken about. And when they do, so I had one case where I was in a training workshop, and this was more of a community of practice for coaches. And it was a 3 or 4 day training, and time after time, the facilitator was using very racially charged language, and I was getting very anxious to say, how can I raise this? And thankfully had friends that I could talk to and consult with about it. And one being Mpo and another my friend Zanele. And really stuck with me what Zani said to me is she said, Jennie, speak from how this is impacting you. Because I was grappling, I said, can I speak on behalf of the people of color in the room, of which there were very few? That feels very patronizing. And she said, Jennie, if it's affecting you, if it's impacting you the way this person is speaking, you still can talk about it from your own positionality. And so I waited to the very last day of the workshop and spoke up with much fear. And the thing that opened up to me was that there was many other people that were wanting to speak, both with fair skin and darker skin, the whole spectrum, wanted to say something about these dynamics that playing out in the work in this workshop, but were too fearful to do so. And I've seen that play out in churches. I've seen that play out in a lot of organizations. So there's some really helpful tools around how do we give feedback. So how do we find voice to raise these things? And I'd love to talk with you further if any of you have found yourself in a space where you want to raise something, but you just feel so fearful of what that might entail. And then on the other side, how do you receive feedback? What kind of posture do you take if someone comes to you and says, actually, something you said, even if it wasn't intended, really didn't come across well? And the first thing is to be present and be willing to listen. And that's going to my last question, is how present am I and how well do I deeply listen? So the practice of deep listening, and it is a practice, means that if someone comes to me with feedback around how I'm showing up, in the skin I'm in the accent I have, in how I come across, can I not immediately take a defense position? Or if there's a topic being put on the table that I'm uncomfortable with, can I deeply listen to where the other person is coming from without trying to justify my stance or to use questions in such a way that changed the trajectory of what they were trying to share with me? I was hoping if we had more time in the session today, but then in discussions with Thorsten, I agreed that I would just save this to the end to leave as an exercise with you. I'm going to ask Thorsten to send around this presentation with these questions. And I would really encourage you to do a practice of deep listening. And what that would look like is to pick one of these questions that I've raised with you today, to find a person. It could be the partner in your household, your spouse, or it could be a trusted friend, and to ask the questions to each other and then listen without it being a conversation. So it can feel a bit forced at first, but it's really effective in doing the practice of actually setting a timer and giving each other 4 or 5 minutes to answer without interruption. And even if the person answers in the first minute, to hold the silence of 4 or 5 minutes. And it's amazing. I've seen this time and again where when someone is given space to speak, especially on these kind of topics, more will come. So if we can hold the silence with each other, create space for each other, more will come. And then when that 4 or 5 minutes are up, all you need to do is just thank the other person for what they've shared. You don't have to comment on it. You don't have to critique it, even if you disagree with them. And then the other person gets the chance to share as well. So if you have time today, or I know we're going into a long weekend with the public holiday coming up, I'd really encourage you to practice this. Take one of the questions from the session today, find a partner, give each other time and space to answer the question for yourself. So I'm going to stop the presentation now so I can hopefully see more people. Okay, so I'm just going to read through. Okay, so there was the question on the difference between racism and xenophobia. So I think there, and again, we don't have a lot of time. I see we only have 5 minutes left. I think what's really helpful, and this is something we spend actually a lot of time within our courses, is to have conceptual clarity on the difference between different forms of prejudice and discrimination, and that they can come from a similar root. And yet it's really helpful to distinguish what is the difference between systemic racism, xenophobia being discrimination or prejudice between different ethnic groups. And I know there was a question later on of the difference between race and ethnicity. So racism being firmly rooted in this, what I was saying earlier, the construction of these racial categories and groups. And then over time, the way in which the hierarchy has been built around that. So with white supremacy on the top, and then the hierarchy of the skin colors according to that. So racism being directly linked to that history, whereas xenophobia being how, and it still can be linked to superiority and inferiority, very much so, and it can play out in different ways. But it's helpful to have conceptual clarity on the difference between these different things, so that when an incident arises, we can actually use that to guide us in saying, okay, what's the root cause? What is going on here? And that does require a longer answer. I'm giving a very short and quick answer. But on that point, I have some resources that I could provide on that. How do we understand the difference between other forms of racial discrimination and racism, other forms of prejudice? There's also colorism, which is even within a so-called race group, where there's a hierarchy created between those with lighter skin and darker skin, and then people being treated accordingly. So it manifests in many different ways, and it's important to understand the differences between those. I talked a little bit about that, the comment of is it intentional? I take a strong view, and this has been part of my journey. And like I said, I've missed many opportunities. Often I've used the excuse of, well, it wasn't intentional, so therefore am I being overly harsh to go and challenge a person on it? And yet I truly believe this is why racism is perpetuating. One of my boys also asked, Mommy, why is there still racism? Why hasn't this gone away? And yet it's because it comes out in so many different ways. It can be overt racism, but can also be very subtle and very unintentional. And those are the difficult conversations that we need to have. Another question from Sean there, how would one differentiate between race? Okay, that's the question about the race socially constructed and ethnicity. How do we acknowledge differences and celebrate similarities without ungodly pride and prejudice? So that's where, yes, a great deal of humility is needed. And yeah, because there can, that's, I guess, how we are as human beings, human nature, that we can start feeling more highly of our group or the group that we identify with than another. And that's the socialization that I was talking about earlier. And in some of the work we do, we talk about ethnicity being often linked to where, the location where a group or people come from. Roots is another term that's being used a lot. And I don't know if any of you have watched, there's some really interesting resources out there on DNA tests that people have done that show the complexity of human ethnicity and roots. And I think the problem is that race as a social construct and ethnicity have gotten collapsed onto each other. And so it becomes very hard to disentangle them and to celebrate who we are in terms of our roots, our heritage, where we come from, the language group or the cultural group that we come from, without that being assumed to be one and the same thing as race. So there's also some great resources out there on that, of how do we disentangle, how do we understand ethnicity as different from race. Does the construction of race... Can I
just briefly interrupt you at this point, just because we're hitting 8 o'clock?
We have 1 minute, I know. Can I
hand
back to you?
We can still continue for a little bit, but
okay.
I just want to be able to let those people go who do need to go, and to thank you while they're still in the room. Just to express a huge thank you to you, Jennie. I think you were... thank you for sharing vulnerably. I know some of these stories aren't easy stories to share. Thank you for scratching in the uncomfortable places, but also in a way that inspires, and in a way that inspires us to do better and to be better. Thank you, Jennie. It's been a very, very valuable session this morning with you. And for those who are able to stay on for a few minutes, we can't keep Jennie forever, but perhaps, Jennie, do you want to just continue with that feed of chats?
So for those of you who have to leave now, a huge thank you. This is quite a different kind of platform for me to use. To not see any of you while I'm presenting is not easy. And on topics like this, I have to say I much prefer to actually be in a room together and talk and see each other. So I'm very conscious of the limitations of the online platform and that feeling of separation for such a topic as this. But thank you for enabling this space again to TGIFX. I'm going to go back through the questions. Okay, I think I was on the question from Kate. Does the construction of race mean there are absolutely no biological or cultural differences between people? And how does the Bible represent God if he has been represented as white in popular culture? How can we convey the biblical version of Jesus? Yes, these are the questions that need to be asked and discussed. And I think when it comes, and I see several people have asked questions of how does the Bible approach this? I think that would be a much longer conversation. I'm not a theologian, but I have, and I see Fred has raised his hand, so we'll come to you just now, Fred. But another organization that I could point you to that does excellent work around this is Isipambano, which is run by a guy named John, and does a lot looking at the theological basis of many of these points that we're discussing today. How does the construction of race? No, absolutely, there are biological and cultural differences between people. It's just that those cannot be, it's a big myth, actually. It's something that we've actually been deceived into, to think that you can know something about someone, either biologically or culturally, by what they look like on the surface. That's the biggest deception. And that's what's so damaging about race, is that there's an assumption that by what I see, when I look at you, that can tell me something about either your biology or your culture or your value system and so on and so forth. Or the ways in which race has just been loaded with, what can it tell me about a person's intelligence or skills or preferences, or, the list can go on. And I think in terms of the question before that, how do we acknowledge our differences? There are many other, I think what I'm saying is there are many other ways to talk about our differences while still acknowledging that race itself is a social construct. And I think just as a caution there, I know this can also be taken in the wrong direction. So by saying race is a social construct or race is a myth, race is not a biological reality. Some people take that too far and will say things like, well, then I don't see color, I don't see race. And unfortunately, that doesn't help the situation. So that's extremely damaging then when people want to talk about racial discrimination and racism. So we need to acknowledge race exists. It's existed because it's been created by human beings, but it doesn't exist inherently in us. And that's something, again, there's a lot of good resources around that if that's something that you're grappling with.
Can I
does the Bible represent?
Can I
yes, go ahead.
Just sort of prod with a follow-on question. It can be quite a minefield, right? So how do we navigate that?
Yeah.
So even the example that you used of the person who came to you and said, "Oh, your kids must be beautiful, must have a I don't know, beautiful color," or whatever the person said. They probably came out of the previous conversation in which they were accused of trying to be colorblind and not properly seeing the other person. So now they're trying this, and then stepping into another can of worms. Think about also, what was the other one, where you were, your friend advised you to speak in the workshop about how this affects you, okay? But then there might have been somebody else in the room, might have then accused you of saying, "Oh, now you're making this all about you. Stop making it all about you." How do you navigate the minefield?
Yeah, very good questions. Sure, Thorsten, yeah. There's no easy answer, but I think you don't run away from the minefields. So it's to say, actually, I'm going to keep trying and I'm going to keep messing up possibly till I get and keep receiving feedback. So if I don't get it right the first time, I'm going to try it again, and I'm going to surround myself with people who can give me very honest feedback as I try. So, and I also will constantly hold up the mirror to say, is the way I'm showing up, is it coming out of an authentic place? And if so, then I can give myself grace if I do mess up, and give others grace as well. But giving grace doesn't mean not having the conversation. And so, like in that example of someone coming to me and asking me, "Oh, what color are your kids?" A question I would ask them, again, this just to hold up the mirror, is to say, if you were encountering colleagues, white-bodied colleagues, would you ask them the same question about your kids? Would that be the first question that you ask them? What color are your kids? Because what it does, it's not necessarily a bad thing. That's why I say there can be natural curiosity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's noticing, how do we assert race to the other person? And that's what I experienced in that moment. And that's how racism often plays out. And that's why I had that image of the person with the target on their back. When you become the subject of the gaze, do you fit into the box or not? So a lot of these things are very subtle, and that's why it is a minefield. And I think the thing is to not give up and say, "Oh, it's just, everyone's just being too sensitive. They must just get a tough skin," and, is realizing that a lot of these things manifest in the subtleties, and we'll only learn how to navigate them by giving and receiving feedback with each other, and not giving up on it just because it feels like it's just all too much and too sensitive. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is. You put me on the spot there, Thorsten. Thank you.
Do you want to take Fred and then continue with the chat?
Yeah.
Thank you for allowing me to put you on the spot.
I was born in Swaziland, grew up as a missionary kid here in South Africa during the apartheid years. Anyway, so I resonated with a lot of what you said. Question number 3, I loved your use of language there. You said, at a personal and organizational level, have we sufficiently interrogated the concept of race? Now, that word interrogation is quite a loaded word. And my question is are there some questions that we can use to interrogate without that loaded part of, I'm trying to get the person to, I don't know, come to my point of view or something? But is there a book, do you have questions that you can use to interrogate? So as an example, I'm a clergy woman, and I often get a response from Christians that clergy woman is an oxymoron, that you really biblically, that's a sin or whatever. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic. But so I've been interrogated as to that position, but I'm saying, what are there some other questions that we can use that gently interrogate people, the organization. I'm coming back to organization because personally there's stuff, but organizationally, I think that was a great question and I loved it. So anyway, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, thank you so much, Cheryl. That's a great question. And you're actually making me wish there was another slide I was going to include, and then I got worried about the time, so I cut it out. But yeah, I'd be very happy, anyone who's interested in that. You know, the tricky thing is, and that maybe this goes to Thorsten's question as well, is there is, as I'm sure you found, even in the example you gave around clergy, there's no formula of a right way to respond or a right question to ask in response to a person who might be bringing something that is very loaded or problematic. But I think the thing that we've, you know, I've been working on a lot in myself and in the organization I work on is how do we stay present to it and not engage from a confrontational, as you said, trying to call the other person out, but at the same time, not just brushing over it. So I think it's using kind of questions that encourage inquiry into where they're coming from. Even in my own family, I mean, I've had one kind of older person in my family, my extended family, that has asked me tough questions, because sometimes to even talk about these things, a person gets very sensitive and thinks the very fact that you're talking about it means that you think that they're racist. So this person in my family asked me, Jennie, because we're talking about this, do you think that I'm racist? Like, are you assuming that I'm racist? And that kind of pressed my buttons, because I didn't, and there was nothing that I had said to suggest that I thought the person was. And so, but I think to answer your question, some of the best first questions to ask are just, firstly, to breathe. I don't have to breathe, and then just ask from a point of inquiry, saying, where, you know, where is that question coming from? Or where is that comment coming from? Or like in the case I gave of that woman at that new church I went to, telling me, you know, just that comment about my son's hair and the dark jeans. I wish I had just at least vocalized my discomfort. I think sometimes without being confrontational, we can voice our discomfort. So just to say in the moment, you know, your question has, your comment has made me quite uncomfortable. Could we talk about it? Could I share with you kind of how that's come across to me? Could we look at that together, the way in which that reinstates a racial category or feels like you're trying to figure out which box to put my children in? So Cheryl, I don't know if that helps, but for the sake of time, I'm very happy. Actually, we've kind of drafted up a whole page full of suggested prompts and follow-up probing questions that can be used to do that interrogation. And yeah, interrogation definitely not meaning like police type interrogation. I think there just means that more thoughtful inquiry of really, can we get to the roots of what's going on? Back to
Jennie,
you, Thorsten.
you set yourself up for giving us a lot of resources, so I need to find a way to get that out there. We need to go at some point. Can I just sort of summarize two more questions that I'm seeing there? I see there are two questions that are similar around the sort of, I suppose, you know, from those of us that are a little bit skeptical around the social justice idea. So one from Michael, I've heard it postulated rather credibly, social justice as a human construct. Oh, my internet connection's unstable. If you don't hear me, just you keep going. So social justice as a human construct stands directly in conflict with God's idea of justice. And then there's a similar question just two further down. Should social justice be incorporated into the core values of a church along with biblical values? Are the two equated? Or should we adopt techniques from the social justice movement? Okay, so just the, you know, I suppose, yeah, I think the questions are clear.
Yeah. That's a whole cluster of questions. Yeah. Sure. That's a big topic. I think you should have another whole session on the issue of social justice. There's many others that could speak a lot, quite helpfully to that. But just from my point of view, I actually would love to see the church lead in this area. I think that's why, social justice as it's, I think, kind of seen in the secular space, unfortunately seems often to be the one that is making the case and trying to bring social justice issues into the light. Whereas I think justice is at the heart of the Christian faith. And it's just how do we interpret that? And that question of do you have any scriptures that could be supportive of social justice being a legitimate Christian standpoint? Sure, yeah, the Bible is full of scriptures on justice. But again, there's always the interpretation of the scripture. But where it talks in Micah about seeking mercy and loving justice, or loving mercy and seeking justice, and many others. I think I'll add that to the list, Thorsten, because I don't have it on hand with me here to actually give the specific scriptures, but there are plenty. And personally, I would love to see the church take the lead and show what a biblically centered approach to social justice would be. And there are churches out there doing it. It's just that unfortunately it has been kind of relegated to a program, where justice work or social outreach is seen as a program of the church rather than central to our work in the world, and bringing God's shalom, bringing reconciliation into the world as part of the heart of the Christian message. But I know it's a big topic. Thorsten, I don't know if you want to say more about that, or if I can.
You're doing awesome. Thank you, Jennie.
Cool. Hi, Jennie. Thanks for the talk. Really cool talk. Hi. So first of all, I think let me just quickly pass by the topic you've been talking about now about social justice. I also, to be frank, I'm not sure how the issue of justice is not central or cannot be considered central, and rather as like a peripheral set of consideration. I mean, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne, scriptures say. I mean, I think it's the entire word of God is littered with the idea of justice more generally, and social justice is just a part of that. But I mean, economics, racism, power, access, equality, poverty, education, those are social justice issues in a broader sense. I'm not sure how we shouldn't advocate for that. But anyhow, let me go to the question I had. Is we're like at an instructive point in time now with what's happening globally, etc. Particularly in the States, with George Floyd and all the protests that have been sparked across the world. It feels like we're in a bit of a pendulum shift type of thing, where I think, even for instance, Black Lives Matter movement has sort of gotten a shot in the arm with what's happening, and everybody is concerned now with, look, this is an actual real issue. Black sort of the injustice that's happening with Black people, etc., across the world, and people finding resonance in their different environments, right? With coming off the top of the George Floyd thing. And for me, I think it's important to look at, I'm trying to track what people's responses to that are, and I'm getting quite, it's pretty scary. I mean, just the spectrum of responses from indifference and outright dismissiveness to partial empathy, etc. I wonder if this is how you see it from sort of interacting with these issues. If you see this as an instructive moment and how it gives an insight into the broader concerns around the world with people in terms of racial equality and so on and so forth. Do you find that there's something in this moment that is instructive? It's not a very clear question, is it? But if you can speak to that, just in terms of the global situation and where we are now, and if you're finding any interesting responses to that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very good question, and I didn't speak much in my talk now to what's happening, but it's very, very present. And when you ask, is it instructive? I think a few things that come to mind is firstly, sure, there's a lot. I think firstly, it's, you know, you have to be very careful of not pointing fingers to this country or that country and saying, oh, that's where the problem lies. And not being willing to turn the gaze back here as well. And that racism operates globally. I mean, it's just, it's what's happening in the United States has already, I mean, there's been things triggered here in South Africa. So this, we're all, I think what I'm saying is it's instructive in the sense of we are all part of this picture. We can't say, oh yeah, that's happening. Oh yeah, you know, well, surely the US has a deep, deep history around slavery and that needs to be addressed. So there are very, I guess what I'm saying is it's instructive for the very unique social circumstances in history and how those play out in particular moments in time and particular places. And the way it's instructive in the way particular forms of leadership, like what we're seeing now with Trump, is so incendiary and so dangerous. So it's instructive in showing us that, yeah, it's revealing things in the United States that have been there all along. And yet it also shows how a particular moment in time can also really either add fuel to the fire or work towards reconciliation and unity. So I think it shows many things, this moment in time. It shows how countries and societies need to continually be tuned in and grappling with their collective histories. It shows the importance of leadership. Who's leading? What are they saying? How are they saying it? What propaganda or narratives are being spread? It shows, yeah, the fact that we are this thing of racism. It's cross-continental. I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen the incident that happened in the school where a South African teacher picked up on this, what had happened with George Floyd, and used that in talking to her students about putting her knee on their neck. I mean, sure. So it's instructive that we can't, you know, assume that any place is like, you know, thank goodness, you know, kind of thank goodness that's not us here. Racism was a system, you know, put in place globally. And so we have to dissect it in our unique context, but also, yeah, across continents, across countries. And then it's very instructive in terms of the power of social movements. So I do think, and I'm hopeful, I hope this is a shift. And people might ask, well, why now? Why did it take this particular moment? Because there's been so many. Yeah, Mpo and I were watching the news the other night, and it was so painful to see how now, I don't know if some of you have seen it, but there's other footage that's finally getting released of other very similar murders at the hands of police that are happening. And so this is kind of opening up a lens into stuff that's been happening all along. So it's not just because it was George Floyd, but it's triggered something. It's a moment in time that I truly hope will be, yeah, will take us forward and challenge us to look at the ways, as you said, Ndaluma, I mean, there's the whole spectrum. There's the whole spectrum from just kind of dismissiveness to this being a huge wake-up call. And also, I mean, people who have been on the forefront of civil rights there and social justice here and working towards racial reconciliation, I know as well that there's a real fatigue. There's a deep, deep exhaustion. And I just, you know, ask that we be really compassionate and have deep, deep empathy for what people are going through right now. How this has triggered many South Africans who have experienced like deep racial trauma, and being sensitive to that this is not just something that's happening in the States. So yeah, sorry, I can go off for a while there. I don't know if that answered your question, Ndaluma, but yeah, I think it's instructive in so many ways. We just need to be alert and tuned in, and hopefully find ways of engaging that's not just on social media, but in the conversations that need to happen.
Thanks, Jenny.
Families in so many other places. Is that fine?
Jenny, I think that also didn't work too badly as closing comments, unless you still unless you still want to add something, in which case you'd be welcome to.
Well, there's one other, it wasn't really a question, but a comment. And I kind of, yeah, I did see it there. And I feel like it's such an important one also to say that I did see that comment from Claude, where it says, sometimes feel that only white people sin. And I guess, you know, the message here is that racism is a very particular sin, and it has a very particular past, and we can't ignore the fact that it was at the hands of people, white-bodied people. But that's by no means to say that, you know, and I think that's why I find that a biblical approach to social justice is critical, because it's so clear that all have sinned. We all fall short of God's glory. And so we need to look at that, you know, them simultaneously side by side, that there are particular sins that play out in society, and we have to be willing to look at those and who the perpetrators are. But that's by no means to say that, you know, one group is more guilty. In God's eyes, we all need redemption. So yeah, I thought that's. I just want to make sure to speak to that point. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennie.